Thank you, Sue, and thank you, Transition, for hosting these wonderful series of talks. So will you excuse me if I feel like my line is going dodgy? I'm going to stop my video at some point. I'm not in my usual space, so apologies in advance if that happens. So very briefly, we're going to be focusing tonight on fermented foods, fruits and vegetables and grains. And by way of an overview, I think there's an awful lot of myth and mystery around the process, the nature of fermenting foods. People are just worried and concerned, and I think that is really a symptom of how disconnected we've become from our food and our planet. Fermented foods is ancient. It's been going since at least Mesopotamian times. And it's found on every continent. Every single human society on every continent has some vestige or thriving tradition of fermented food cuisine. And the beauty of it is that it can be practiced by anyone, anywhere, and with pretty much any food. It's not restricted to fruits, vegetables, and grains. It can be done with dairy and fish and meat. And in this day and age, I think the really exciting thing about the return of growing interest in preserving foods using fermentation is that it's something that really everybody can do. It's not rocket science, it's just playing with bacteria and food. And in doing so, I feel it really connects us with our wild food culture, with our ancestors who've done this work in their past as part of their culinary heritage. And the other thing is, it feels to me like it's increasingly becoming a really valid political statement about what we think of food. Specifically, I think fermented foods represent a viable alternative to process production systems. Those have become increasingly less transparent. It's hard to know what the ingredients are, what they're used for, what their function is in the recipe. These these big food producers pump out mass-produced foods. We don't really know how they're made. They're very, very different from their raw food counterparts, and quite often they have much diminished nutritional value. So if you are looking for reclaim your right as a human being and a fellow being on this planet, then I can doing so by preserving food naturally. Of course, the other thing to remember is that I'm just going to go stop video. There we go. The other thing to remember about fermented food is that it's one of many different ways of preserving food naturally that involve no refrigeration and can help us reduce food waste by giving our food gluts, our crop gluts from our veg patches, a little bit of an extra ability. So that's by way of an introduction. Meg's going to take the next bit, which is about specifically about grains, and then I'm going to finish. I'm going to come in and do fermented fruits and vegetables, and then we'll round up. Meg will round up at the end before we go into questions. And if you, as Sue said, do please put your questions as they occur to you into the chat box. And the other thing that would be really lovely to know is that if you are a complete beginner, can you flag yourself up in the chat box as though you were a complete beginner? Because it would be good to know, what balance of audience we have here. Who's done a bit, who's dabbled, who's done nothing, who would love to become an expert in it, or who already is an expert in it. Let us know. So let me hand over to Meg now.
Thanks very much, Jackie.
Fuck, I've frozen.
Thanks, Jackie. I'm going to start by telling you a bit about preserving grains as a sourdough culture. And I thought I'd start with this lovely quote by Sandor Katz, who's a bit of a guru of fermentation. Grains nourish us best with the pre-digestion of fermentation, which is very important, and I'll talk a little about that. Sandor Katz has written several books. He's got a great book called Wild Fermentation, and we'll put a link in the chat as the talks progress. So if I could have the next slide, please, Anna. So why would you ferment grains? During fermentation, during the process of it, naturally occurring enzymes break carbohydrates down into sugars, which makes them more accessible to our bodies. The yeasts in the grains feed on the sugars, and they produce carbon dioxide and alcohol. So the two obvious uses for these are bread and beer. And you need carbon dioxide from the yeast to raise your bread. It does that by forming bubbles within the web of gluten inside the dough. And the beer is obviously derived from the alcohol in the yeasts. Before the 1900s, there was no commercial yeast, and bakers and brewers relied on culturing their own, and what was naturally present on the grains. So yeast are wild on the grains and preserved through the milling process if it's done well, and I'll talk a bit about that in a minute. Sometimes bakers would use some ferment from a brewer to create a baker's balm or a sourdough made from beer. So preserving, by growing sourdough, by culturing it ourselves, we keep the culture of doing it alive. We're preserving a traditional culture, and we're keeping on with the traditional way of baking. We're also preserving, by feeding and nurturing our sourdoughs, the culture itself, the actual yeasts and the culture that's resulted during the fermentation process from that. And I'll talk a little bit about keeping and making a sourdough culture too. The flavour is hugely enhanced with a fermentation. So anyone who's eaten sourdough, or properly made sourdough at least, will know that. It's got depth and richness, and it's actually quite addictive, or can be. I worked with an artisan baker once who said that his customers became loyal after just one bite. And I think that it's not just a little bit of puffed up baker speak, but actually it's very true. I think if people taste sourdough, it's so different compared to the normal bread that we have in the UK, at least, that it's a completely different animal, really. And I certainly had very loyal customers when I had my bakery who were with me at the beginning and were still with me at the end. And then the other reason is health, a happy digestive process. There are really important benefits to gut health with naturally leavened bread, and I'll come to that in a bit. So if I could have the next slide, please, Jackie. Thank you. So I want to talk about I want to talk a bit about local grains. Buying and growing food locally is really important to me. I think it makes us more resilient, and it's a way of keeping our own Cambridge or local culture going regarding food. And it also keeps us safer from any fluctuations in the world, global food markets. So it's got to be good. This is Helen Holmes, who's growing organic heritage grain at a farm on the Fen Edge. She grows in a wildlife and soil friendly way, in a very traditional way. So she started last year growing these traditional preserved and heritage grains by sowing it by hand, broadcasting, and then she harvested using a scythe. She uses these small hand crank machines for the threshing. That's a winnower, the picture in the middle. And she has a mill, a small tabletop mill to mill the flour. She produces small quantities of grain, but with a superb flavour. She let me bake with some, and it's really good. She only produces very little. She produces it for courses she runs out at the farm, where people can learn to bake using a wood-fired oven. So there's a picture of her with the oven she built. There's going to be a link in the chat for Helen's Instagram account. Though we can't buy from Helen, we can really buy stuff locally. We're very lucky here. So if I can have the next slide, please. Thanks. So the one on the left is the watermill in Little Salkeld in Cumbria. It's the reason that the bakers from the northeast would travel over the Pennines after a long shift to get good flour, stone ground flour, and milled in a traditional way, in a mill that uses purely natural power. There was a reason also to be very happy when I moved to Cambridge to find that there was a local mill. This is Foster's Mill. It mills the Prior's flour over in Swaffham Prior, and it's absolutely excellent as a source of flour. Now, both these mills grind flour between stones in the old-fashioned way, and that is essential for sourdough because the yeasts are alive on the grains and stay in the flour as it's milled. They will then be able to grow and culture in the fermentation. If flour's milled in a commercial mill with steel roller mills that worked very quickly and heat up very fast, the heat will actually kill off most of the yeasts, and it will be really difficult, if not impossible, to make a sourdough culture from it because it will be too hot. So if I could have the next slide, please. So this is more about health and good food and the Chorleywood bread process. It was invented in the early 1960s, and it's an industrial process of bread making. And it's basically dominated the UK food market ever since. I think more than 75% of bread bought in Britain is made by the Chorleywood bread process. So the loaf on the right is that, the loaf on the left is a sourdough loaf made traditionally. And the very great difference is the amount of ingredients. So for the sourdough loaf on the left, there are 3 ingredients: flour, water, and salt. That's it. Made a lovely loaf. However, the loaf on the right uses the basic 3 ingredients: flour, water, salt, plus yeast, masses of it. It's pumped full of yeast to make it rise quickly. And it has other ingredients that you would maybe not realise about, flavour enhancers, preservatives. There's bleach used to whiten the flour in white loaves. Plus, there are various enzymes with various functions, one of which is derived from a pig's pancreas. None of this needs to be declared specifically on the label. Our law doesn't require it to be. And the enzymes and other ingredients that aren't natural food will make the loaf more puffy, softer, make it last longer. But it's very difficult to see how it can be called bread. It's basically an industrial product. The loaf on the left also has taken a lot longer to produce. And that's important too. That's really one of the secrets of the flavour and the health that comes with sourdough, because the time taken is 48 hours at least from beginning to end. So for the loaf on the left, I would have started feeding the cultures, say on a Wednesday morning, and it would have been fed several times, and then the culture would have been used to make the dough. Typically, a fifth of the culture is the proportion in a dough mix for sourdough. There are different recipes, but that's a typical one. And then it would have bulk risen overnight, and then it would have been shaped and had another proving rise. And during all that time, before it even went in the oven, the gluten would have been relaxing and softening and developing and maturing. And that's what makes it digestible. Whereas with the loaf on the right, it's taken 1.5 hours from the very beginning of mixing to the resulting loaf going into its plastic wrapper. There is a movement called the Real Bread Campaign, which is working on trying to get a better loaf act, a better bread law, to ensure that we get things put on labels of bread, and that sourdough bread isn't, that the label sourdough isn't used by industrial loaf manufacturers. So there's going to be a link in the chat for that. Do have a look, it's a really great website. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So a little bit about natural yeast and commercial yeast. Obviously the commercial yeast, the quick fix, nothing wrong with it. I do encourage you to bake bread at all. Any bread you bake will be better than buying a bread made with the Chorleywood bread process. And it's always better to make your own, using good flour too. Fresh yeast probably is better, but it's really difficult to get. I have seen it for sale in whole food shops, but they do sell out as soon as it comes in pretty much. Best of all, and I hope to encourage you to grow a culture like the one on the right. It's slowly grown. It's made just with flour and water. There's nothing else added. And you can make your own quite simply. So if I could have the next slide, please. Thanks. So this is how I keep my cultures. They're kept in the fridge in these plastic tubs with lids. And when I want to use them, I'll get them out of the fridge and let them come to room temperature for a couple of hours or so before I feed them. Now, the one on the right, the wheat, is just out of the fridge and it's settled out. So it's got some liquid at the top. That's perfectly normal. And I tend to pour it off because that liquid is quite strong tasting, contains a lot of acid. It's a natural process, it's fine. It doesn't do any harm at all. It can be good for you. It's just that the flavour of the bread will be much stronger and much sourer if you mix that in. And I prefer a gentle, more sweet sourdough myself, so I tend to pour it off. The stuff on the sides of the tubs is just dried starter. There's nothing to worry about with that. It happens normally, and I tend to keep it and scrape it down as I feed the starters because you don't know what yeasts are in it. There's all sorts of yeasts that grow on grains and will be present in the flour if you buy stone ground flour. So it's worth keeping those bits on the side in case they have a special bit of culture in. When I've fed them, which I do by doubling in volume, so say with the wheat on the right, if I've poured off the top liquid, I'll then make it up to about the bottom of the wheat label on the front there. So double the volume using just the same flour plus water and mixing it to the consistency of a thick batter, quite a thicker than pancake batter. So it will drop rather than run off the spoon. The singing sourdough is about, well, when we feed these lovely starters, and they start to develop their carbon dioxide and they emit it, and the gases are held under the lids, but because the culture works fast, the little bits of gas can be forced out from under the lid, and it makes lovely singing sounds. Sometimes there's several singing at once, which is really nice, and you know that they're very much alive when they're doing that. On the other hand, the cautionary tale is one to never please keep your sourdough culture in glass with a lid. I keep them in plastic for a good reason. There's been a few sourdough cultures for sale in whole food shops that I've seen in glass jars, and I know other people keep them in glass jars. And I did keep some in a glass jar last summer. I was aware of the risk, but I had it out of the fridge and I'd fed it, and it was quite cool weather, but the weather changed and I'd forgotten. And when I saw it, the top was actually doming because the gas was forcing the top of the jar up. So I put it outside quickly before it exploded, and within an hour it had exploded. Luckily it didn't break the glass, but it forced the top off with such force that it splattered sourdough about 3 foot up the wall of our house. And I do know a baker who had some in a glass jar that exploded, and it did actually break the glass, and shards of the glass went right through a roll of kitchen foil. It comes out with that amount of force, so it's not to be messed with, and plastic is safer. And like I say, the gases will just come out of the lids if it needs to. So if I could have the next slide, please. That what you can do with your cultures. Ah, yes, I forgot this one. So this is what it looks like in process. So on Saturday at 3 o'clock on the top left, I took it straight out of the fridge. I then poured off the liquid, let it come up to room temperature. At 5 o'clock, I fed it flour and water, just like I've explained. And you can see at the bottom right, on Saturday, it was still quite inert. But come Sunday morning early, it had come to life. It's bubbling up. It's a totally viable culture. And I'd probably typically feed it twice more and leave it again to bubble up and then use it for baking. So next slide, please. Thank you. What you can do with it, you can bake bread with it. And I really encourage you to have a go. It's a lovely, lovely thing to do. There's lots of books on the subject. I can't talk about baking here. There just isn't time. There are blogs online, there's online workshops. I'm thinking of running an online workshop myself about making rye bread specifically. So if you're interested in that, I think Anna's going to put my bakery email in the chat. That's Abundance Bakehouse. do get hold of me and I'll put you on the mailing list if you'd like to come. It will be on Zoom in the next few, well, definitely after Easter, sometime in the next few months. But if you don't want to bake bread, if it feels like too much, if you don't have time and you want to make a culture and just try it out, have a go. And then you can make pancakes. They're delicious. I tend to put some culture in a bowl. I might add an egg. You don't have to if you're vegan. I might add a bit of milk, oat milk. You can add spices, honey, fruit, nuts. The pancake on the bottom right was rather a nice one, made with cinnamon in the mix and then with cream and banana and some raisins. I think that's probably all I've got to say, except I just hope I've encouraged you to have a go with making a starter. And just to finish by saying, there's no mystique to starter making. You don't need to buy a bit. You don't need someone to give it to you. If someone does give you it, it's a great gift, and do treat it with respect. It's something that bakers like to do for each other. But all you need is the stone ground flour and water. Mix it together in a bowl, put it on the kitchen worktop, cover it just for dust. You don't need to do anything else to it. And after 3 days, you should see bubbles coming up. If you don't, leave it a bit, maybe feed it a little bit more and keep it going. And if you've got good flour, for instance, from Foster's Mill, then you should have a sourdough culture going and you can feed it, build it up, use it like this, put it in the fridge to keep. And when you want it, get it out and build it up again. Always leave a bit of sourdough culture in your tub so you can start it easily for the next batch. Right, thanks very much. I'm going to hand over to Jackie now to tell you about fermenting fruit and veg.
Hi, everybody. My connection is really unstable. I'm just literally going to turn my video off. And is Anna looking after the slides? Perhaps we could start with the second slide on. So that's just the title screen. Can we skip straight to the second one? Thank you. So the process. So yeah, so I'm going to be talking about fermenting fruits and vegetables, more vegetables than fruits, it has to be said. That's the easiest thing to start off with. And first of all, I just want to kind of tell you the kind of key things about the process, because as I said, there's so much mysticism and anxiety. When I talk to people who've had a go at fermenting vegetables, people are kind of quite often worried that they're not doing it right, concerned that it didn't look how it or smelt or tasted how they thought it would. There's a lot of kind of concern about it, and all that feeds into a state of like fear of our food, which I think is really feels like it's almost at the root of our disconnect with our planet. So the process of fermenting foods relies on a family of bacteria called Lactobacillus, and they are a salt-tolerant anaerobic bacteria that create lactic acid. Simply, what happens is they consume the sugars in fruits and vegetables, simple sugars, convert that to lactic acid, and then there is a byproducts that come off are CO2, carbon dioxide, ethanol, and occasionally acetic acid, which is like a vinegar acid. And all of this happens within a temperature range of between 15 and 22 degrees C. That's a cool house, I would say. I mean, you know, a little bit of heat won't do too much harm, but if the temperatures are too far above there for a length of time, or to below it for a length of time, then the fermentation process simply just grinds to a halt, and you know, you won't end up with a proper fermented food at the end of the day. So Lactobacillus is this family of bacteria. They are so common, and this, I think, is the thing that really taps us into our planet and our world, is that lactic acid bacteria is found almost everywhere. You can find it on the skins of vegetables and fruits, can exist on human skin. It's in dairy products. You can find it even on your veg patch in your decomposing plants. And the process that it uses is an anaerobic one, so that's without oxygen. And that's pretty key. So from that slide, the three things that we need that are critical is the temperature, the pH, the lack of air, and salt. And the other thing I've got to say is that that's right. So the food spoilage organisms, which are the bad guys, they tend to thrive in aerobic situations, and they don't like being in a highly acidic or an acidic environment. Once you get the pH of your food down to about 4.6, 4.2, this is all the bit of science that I know. I'm not a scientist, so it's not rocket. It's not. It's beginner level science, if you like. But 4.6 to 4.2 is like a weak acid level, and it's enough to inhibit the bad guys, and is acceptable and a good environment for the good guys, the lactobacillus. Could we have the next slide, please, Anna? Okay. So the benefits, I think I briefly touched on them in the introduction. The health benefits, I think, are really only just starting to come to light. There's an awful lot of research out there. You just need to Google it for the detail. That consuming small amounts, only small amounts really, of fermented foods regularly, that's at least once or twice a day, can have really big benefits in your gut bacterial flora, your gut biome. And there's some studies around that show that incidences of breast cancer in human societies where fermented food is commonly eaten are much lower than they are in Western countries like USA and America and parts of Western Europe. Eastern Europe still has quite a strong culture of using fermented foods. It's undeniably tasty. It's a little bit of an acquired taste. A really strong ferment that's gone on for quite some time can be pretty sour. And sour isn't a flavour that is sort of uppermost in Western cultures. We tend to like things more salty or sweet. But sour is something that kind of grows on you, and definitely worth persevering with. And then the other beauty of this that I absolutely love in a kind of world that really, really, really needs to start using less energy and power is that it really represents a method of storage without spoilage. I really like that. You can keep your glut of tomatoes or cabbages or whatever it is you're growing or buying for much longer than you would in their natural state, and with no cost in terms of energy to kind of keep things cool. So let's move on to the next slide, which is what you need. Now, this is the bit I really feel like I'm on a soapbox when I talk about, is that with fermented foods, you go online, you will very quickly come across gadgets like airlocks, special crocks that you need to buy to put your chopped up veg in. All of this is nice, but not necessary. All you really need are the following things. So first of all, some suitable veg, and I've listed the ones that I think are best for beginners to start off with. Having looked through the chat, we've got a lot of beginners, which is really great, and I echo Meg to say that, absolutely get in there and have a go with something, and this you won't regret it. You really won't. So suitable veg, easy stuff to start off with. You've got cabbage, celery, courgettes, peppers, cucumbers. Those are probably the easiest ones. Root vegetables are also doable. Carrots and beetroot are quite common, and you'll find plenty of recipes using those. Mooli radish, or even the sort of common or garden radishes that you can grow, are also pretty easy to do ferments with. I like to start off with my first ever attempt at ferment was on the workshop that I didn't actually run. I just helped to organise, and we had this lovely lady called, oh my God, I've forgotten her name. It's gone out of my head. Lovely woman from I think it was Jacobs. Can't remember her name. Anyway, it'll come to me. I'll look it up. She came up and we did this fantastic workshop out at Fen Farm, where it's a lovely organic farm stead where they produce vegetable boxes and stuff. And we had this big tent. There was about 20 of us crammed into the tent. And the first thing we did was to get stuck into chopping up all the vegetables. And then we added salt. Now it's pretty important that you use a good quality salt, cleaner the better. It's generally recommended to avoid table salt because that contains anti-caking agents and iodine, and those additives can sometimes interfere with the ferment process, and you won't get a good clean ferment. So yeah, salt, rock salt, kosher salt are the best ones to go for. I suppose you could also use the Malvern table salt, but does work out at quite an expensive way of doing it. Rock salt's by far and away the cheapest. You can add seasonings. Herbs, common herbs to use would be things like fresh thyme, fresh oregano, fennel, dill, those kind of things. Parsley would work. Garlic can also work. People like to put garlic in. It does get quite strong. I think the garlic intensifies its flavors when you ferment. And then you can use spices, and I'm particularly fond of using things like mustard seeds, because mustard has a good antimicrobial property as well. Not that I think you need it, but it kind of brings everything all together. A little bit of spice is pretty good. But you can go a bit more chili if you like. You can do more sort of cumin-y style spices that give a little Indian style, Asian style twist to your ferment. Anything goes really. It's just what you like. I definitely say go easy on the seasonings, particularly in your first batches, because of the kind of the changes in the flavors. It's a bit of an unknown, so just go, just a little bit is better than lots to start with. Next, you need a suitable vessel. I use some large wide neck jars. I'm sorry I haven't got photos because I'm not actually at home at the moment. But a large wide neck jar, something that you could easily put your hand into and your fist into, because that's important when we come to the how you do it. And it needs a loose fitting lid. Thanks, Sally. Jill Jacobs, who gave us the fermenting workshop. I've just seen that in the chat. So a loose fitting lid. If you use something like a Kilner jar with a clamp top lid, I like to take out the rubber seal just to kind of, but still clip it down, and that gives enough release to allow the carbon dioxide out and stop your jar from exploding. If you've just got a jar with a screw top lid, just loosely fit it and just give it one twist, but don't tighten it down really, really hard. And then, highly important, we mentioned earlier on that this is an anaerobic process, so all your vegetables need to be excluded from the presence of oxygen and air. So you need some weights to keep everything submerged. And I've played around with different weights in the past. They've included things that I'm going to show you on the next slide, please, Anna. There we go. Here's a couple of ideas. So on the left, you can see there's a Kilner jar there and a smaller jar that's being used to sort of fit neatly inside the top of the jar with your veggies in it. And you can fill that with water or maybe rice or dried beans or something like that. But something that's weighty enough to keep all that vegetable down. What happens is that as the ferment gets going, one of the byproducts is carbon dioxide, and that as that moves up, because that's quite light, as that moves up, that can dislodge, that can kind of expand out your vegetables and then push everything up to the top with the carbon dioxide, and then you've got exposure to air, which means you're going to get problems, you're going to get mold. So keep everything down with a weighty jar. And on the right, there's this is a great little thing which I found on the internet. I haven't actually tried this, but I can visualize how this would work really well. This is a slice of a turnip, which you peel. You can cut it. You want to cut it so it's a good sort of inch or so. Sorry, that's about 2.5 centimeters deep. And then you want to put a core in it, and that hole in the middle there is so that come the day when you're ready, when your ferment is ready, and you want to kind of have a little taste, you can put your finger in there and pull that out really easily. If you try and fiddle around with the sides, you're going to break it, and your ferment might not have finished, and you may need to reintroduce that weight to carry on a bit longer. Now then, what have I got to tell you about there? Oops, hang on, I've just lost my place. Bear with. Okay, so I'm just going to tell you the process while we're looking at those pretty pictures. So number one, I'm just going to do this really well. You don't need to make notes. You can find this anywhere on the internet, and I'll put a couple of website references in the chat now for you, so you can look up later. So the first thing you do, you want fresh and seasonal vegetables. If you can get organic, that would be great, because they will definitely have no chemical residues that may interfere with the viability of the lactic acid bacterial processes. So fresh and seasonal, definitely. Don't use old veg that's hanging around, because the sugars that the lactic acid bacteria need, the lactobacillus need, will have turned to starch and won't be so accessible. You want to slice everything pretty finely. Some people like to use a mandolin. It's not obligatory. I've used a grater in the past. That works quite well, or just like a good sharp knife and slice, slice, slice. You want to weigh everything and make sure that you've got no more than 2% of salt, to the 2% of the weight of all your ingredients in salt is what you add. So if your cabbage weighs 1 kilo, you use 20 grams of salt. I'm sorry, I'm no mathematician either, so I can't tell you if your cabbage and ingredients weigh 980 grams. I'm sorry, I won't be able to do that calculation. You'll be able to have to do it yourself. Hope you don't mind. So once you've got your salt and your veggies all in one big container, you give it a thoroughly good mix. Mix it all up. Hands are by far and away the best thing to do. So let's make sure they're clean to start with. Don't over scrub. You know, we're not in a hospital environment here. It's just a normal kitchen. Mix everything up really thoroughly, and then ideally pound it with the blunt end of a rolling pin if you've got one, or a milk bottle would do, or a sort of heavy, a largish jar that you can grasp easily, and just pound it. And even your fist actually is even better. The fist is the best thing. And then once you've started to pound it a little bit, you'll notice that the juices in the vegetables will start to be released, and they'll mix with the salt, and the salt has a slightly what's the word? You know, when God, I've forgotten it. When you draw osmotic effect, that's the word. When you it has an osmotic effect on the juices in the salt, the presence of salt with a few juices will pull out more juices, and you'll very quickly end up with a nice sort of juicy wet mixture, which is what you want. If you're completely lazy, I've done this a few times, it works perfectly fine, but it's not the best way, because your vegetables are not they're not, well, what I sometimes have done is like chop up my vegetables, mix it up with salt, pound it a bit, and then put a lid on it and leave it overnight, and the next morning there's plenty of juice there. It'll work more naturally. I suppose the downside to that is if you're wanting to do as best you can, then to do the pounding yourself and then put everything under the juice quickly means that you've got less exposure to oxygen and air. So I suppose the traditional way of pounding everything thoroughly is better. However, I'm not one for sticking to rules and recipes. I can't seem to have to change everything I do at least once. So there we go. And I'm saying that really just because this is a very real personal process, and you do what you need to do. So if you feel like playing around with it and you feel confident in doing that, then great. And if you don't and you want to stick to the recipe, then stick to the recipe. Everything goes. So once you've sliced and pounded your veggies, you want to push them into a jar using your fist. Push them right down so you're getting rid of as many air bubbles as you possibly can. And as you do that, as you keep filling and keep pushing down with your fist, you'll notice that the juices start to rise to the top. And when you've got to leaving about depending on the size of your jar, between 3/4 and 7/8 of the jar full of vegetables with a good layer of juice on top. I like to cover that with one of the outside cabbage leaves that I've saved from slicing up. Lay that over like a little blanket, and then over the top of that you put your weight, and then you put your lid, and then you're done. That is literally it. All of that process can take no more than about, well, depending on the size of the cabbage that you're doing, can take about an hour, maybe take even less. It depends how quick you are. And then you put it in a coolish place, watch it and wait for between 5 and 6 days. You'll see some bubbles starting to form after about 3 to 5 days. And at that point, you know you've got a good ferment going. Sometimes the bubbles are slow to happen and sometimes they're very faint. Don't worry about it. The process, so long as you've covered the fresh vegetables, no air, enough salt, but not too much salt, you'll be all right. So if we could move on to the next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a few problems. I'm going to call them problems, but they're not fatal problems to your ferment. They're just things to be aware of, and I'm telling you these so that you can perhaps feel a little bit reassured that, okay, I'm doing it, it's not turned out how I expected, but it's not bad. So the first thing you might notice, that one of the most common problems is mushy or soft veg when you've done your ferment, and quite often that's because your room temperature is a bit high. I do notice that I always think, ooh, in a heat wave, like as the weather starts to warm up in May, June, that's when I sometimes think, yeah, I really fancy some sauerkraut if I haven't got any in the fridge. And I think, well, I'll just make some. And after a while, I realised that actually it's really better to do the fermenting in the kind of late spring when the temperatures are just kind of getting to within that 15 to 22 degree level. If you wait until they're too high, what happens is that bacteria that don't normally are not normally around at the start of the process, they don't initiate the growth of the development of the ferment, come into action. They're kind of heat triggered, so they come into action too early, and they're desirable, and they do things like they soften the texture of the vegetables and they produce some of the more sour flavors, but they don't do. They come in too early, so you end up with a more mushy or soft vegetable ferment, which is, you may like it, but I prefer my veggies a bit crunchy, so I don't. So if that happens, watch your room temperature. That's a really good thing. The other thing that may have occurred is that you haven't got quite enough salt in your mix. I did, because I'm not very scientific, I'm a great one in doing things by eye, and I've realised with some processes it is really worth paying a bit more attention and doing things properly by weighing your vegetables and getting it right, because the salt levels are pretty critical. Too low and you will get mushy vegetables. The converse of that problem is on the next slide, which is a crunchy, very salty ferment. Might not even be a ferment, actually. You may have put so much salt in there that you've just basically got vegetables in brine, and they're very crunchy and they haven't really properly fermented. That's not necessarily a problem. You can rinse, some people quite like a salty veggies. They're very tasty, it's true, but if you find them too salty, you can rinse off some of the salt. You may not be able to get the ferment going again. I've heard that that's quite difficult. So don't worry about it. You can still eat the vegetables. You can recook them if you want, or just eat them. And the reason that you get a salty, crunchy ferment that maybe hasn't fermented is perhaps the vegetables are sliced too thick. That means the lactic acid bacteria can't access the sugars in the veggies quickly enough to get going, and the salt will too much salt will inhibit that lactic acid ferment as well. So your solutions there are to more finely slice your vegetables and perhaps reduce the salt quantity if you haven't been precise enough in the first place. So our next problem is a little bit more scary. I'll just tell you about it. So Kahm yeast, spelled Kahm yeast. This is a light, sort of pale dusting that occurs on vegetables when the fermenting conditions are too warm. It might give you a different flavour. It's not dangerous. You can skim it off and still eat your kraut. It might be a little bit different flavoured from what you expect, but it's still okay. Really one of the most common things that you see. There's a light fizzy, sort of like a pale looking colour to it, and when you break the surface, if you mix it in with water, it will flake up. It'll be like little specks of, I don't know, dandruff. That's a Kahm yeast. So the next one here, this is fermentation problems with grey or blue surface molds. That is generally a result of having air access the vegetables, and those are spoilage organisms. They're not desirable. They won't kill you, but they're pretty unpleasant looking. And if you've got a few molds a bit like the ones on the left, that may be blue or black or grey, but just a few, and you can skim them off, then you could do that. Maybe take a little bit of the ferment underneath the vegetables and see what the flavour is like underneath that. It might be all right. If, on the other hand, you've got a lot of mould, like the picture on the right, I would say it's unlikely that it's going to taste nice. You probably have quite a sort of funky smell, and it may not be worth bothering about. And certainly if you feel kind of nauseous or scared or are unnerved by the sight of that, you may actually just want to ditch it. Don't throw it in the bin, throw it on your compost. It's all perfectly fine. So that's that. Okay, and so very briefly, I'm just going to tell you about fermenting fruits, which is completely different process. Most fruits want to turn to alcohol, which is a different type of fermentation. So we want to sometimes kickstart the fruits into going down the lactic acid route by introducing some lactic acid starter culture. So you might want to use some live kombucha culture if you can get your hands on it. You can buy that in the shop, but ask anybody who's doing kombucha, they'll give you some. It's as common as muck in the summer in my house, so I'm very happy to share that with people. You can also use a little bit of whey from a yogurt. It's the sort of like clear, slightly yellow liquid that occurs on the top of a live yogurt. Spoon a little bit of that in, that might help. Or you can use some of your sort of briny mix from a vegetable ferment as well. That will help to kickstart it. The whole process is way quicker, so 24 to 48 hours max. The kind of fruits that you might want to use will be berry fruits, work really well, as do stone fruits. Apples and pears can be done. I think they're a little bit more challenging, so probably not for beginners. And in the links that I sent to Anna was a very good recipe, or good sounding recipe for a rhubarb live lactic acid chutney, which, as we're coming into rhubarb season, I thought that might be good to try. And the final advice piece for fruits is that you should, once you've done your ferment and you've got a nice sort of lightly fizzy, slightly sour but still very juicy kind of flavour to your ferment, they're done. Store them in the fridge and eat them quickly, so they're not quite as long-lived as vegetables. And that's all there is to it. It's really easy. I really hope you have a go at trying it. And